History loves a clean hero. Give a man a statue, a dramatic nickname, maybe a school textbook chapter, and suddenly the blood, cruelty, hypocrisy, and wildly suspicious personal behavior get politely swept under the marble. Today we are looking at famous heroes whose legends survived, mostly because history hired a very generous editor. Some were brilliant, some changed the world, and some were also absolute nightmares with excellent public relations. 1. Vasco da Gama gets celebrated as the fearless Portuguese navigator who cracked open the sea route from Europe to India, which sounds majestic until the story suddenly turns into oceanic horror with sails. On one voyage, he seized a ship carrying Muslim pilgrims, robbed it, locked the passengers inside, and had it burned, with women and children among those pleading for mercy and offering riches just to stay alive. This was not a messy accident in battle or some panicked fire at sea. It was calculated brutality, the kind designed to announce, "Welcome to diplomacy, we brought flames." That is the rotten secret under many explorer statues. The plaque says "Discoverer," while the evidence says "Mass violence with excellent navigation skills." Da Gama was brave enough to cross dangerous oceans. He was also ruthless enough to turn a pilgrimage ship into a floating nightmare. 2. George Washington is remembered as the dignified founder who rejected kingship, surrendered power, and became the marble-faced symbol of Republican virtue. Lovely image. Shame about the loopholes. When Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law threatened to free enslaved people who stayed there long enough, Washington did not rise above slavery like a man carved from pure liberty. Instead, he rotated enslaved workers out of the state before they could qualify for freedom, using legal tricks to protect ownership while keeping his public image polished. That is not just being a man of his time. That is active planning to keep people trapped. So the great emblem of freedom was also quietly managing human lives like a plantation spreadsheet with better posture. The contradiction is not decorative, it is central. Founding-era liberty had a nasty habit of stopping exactly where elite comfort began. 3. William the Conqueror is often packaged as the bold king who remade England, changed its future, and gave historians a nice dramatic turning point to point at. Then you reach the harrying of the North, and suddenly the heroic glow starts smelling like smoke. After rebellion in northern England, William responded with a scorched earth campaign that burned villages, destroyed food stores, wrecked farms, and made survival itself a strategic casualty. Medieval writers and later historians offered shocking death estimates, sometimes above 100,000, though the exact number is still debated. What is not debated is the suffering. Famine, ruin, and ordinary people crushed under royal punishment. This was not tidy law enforcement in chainmail. It was terror used as government policy. William built a kingdom, yes. But first, he helped turn whole regions into a wasteland and called the silence order. 4. Richard the Lionheart may be one of England's most aggressively polished heroes, which is hilarious when you remember he spent very little time in England and probably treated the place less like a homeland and more like a royal bank account with bad weather. His reign was dominated by crusading glory, continental wars, and expensive ambitions that needed money, preferably from England. The darkest stain came after Acre in 1191, when negotiations with Saladin dragged on and Richard ordered the killing of roughly 2,700 Muslim prisoners. These were captives, not soldiers charging at him in combat, and the massacre disturbed even some people in his own brutal century. So the noble crusader image starts looking suspiciously like medieval marketing. Richard was courageous and militarily brilliant. He was also capable of spectacular cruelty and far more devoted to fame than to the country that later turned him into a patriotic mascot. 5. Charles Dickens wrote masterpieces about poverty, cruelty, hypocrisy, broken families, and the emotional wreckage caused by cold institutions, which makes his own behavior toward his wife feel extra grotesque. When his marriage to Catherine Dickens fell apart, letters suggest he tried to have her placed in an asylum, even though a doctor found no evidence that she was mentally ill. Why would a champion of compassion do something that vile? because Catherine had become inconvenient to a famous man who wanted freedom, control, and space for a relationship with a much younger actress. That is not tragic romance. That is vanity trying to use Victorian respectability like a disposal service. It sounds almost too cruel for one of his own villains, except real life kindly provided the receipt. Dickens could expose hypocrisy brilliantly on the page while somehow missing the factory-sized version running inside his own home. 6. Captain James Cook was a brilliant navigator and mapmaker whose voyages changed Europe's understanding of the Pacific. That part is true. The problem begins when "great explorer" is said in that clean museum voice that forgets the people already living in the places he mapped. Cook often used coercion when cooperation did not appear quickly enough, including seizing property or detaining important local figures to force compliance. The most famous disaster came in Hawaii, where he tried to take the ruling chief Kalaniʻōpuʻu hostage after a boat was stolen, hoping to use him as leverage. The plan collapsed violently, and Cook died on the beach. His voyages also fit the wider imperial pattern of contact that brought disease, threats, guns, and cultural arrogance into island societies with limited immunity. Cook was exceptional with charts. He was far less inspiring when the human cost arrived with him. 7. Simón Bolívar is honored across South America as the liberator, the grand revolutionary who helped break Spanish imperial power and became a symbol for entire nations. But the pedestal gets shakier when you look at his 1813 decree of war to the death. That decree declared that Spaniards who did not actively support independence could be killed, while Americans who supported the Royalists might still be spared. In plain language, mercy could depend heavily on identity and allegiance in the middle of a brutal civil war. Bolívar was not operating in a gentle classroom debate, and the conflict around him was already savage. But context does not magically perfume exterminatory logic into nobility. Revolutions can produce their own cruelty once vengeance puts on a justice costume. Bolívar helped free nations, absolutely. He also proved that liberator and terrifying wartime decree author can share the same statue. 8. Alexander the Great is history's premium action figure conqueror, the man who sprinted across continents and made the ancient world look like it needed better cardio. But once you step away from the shiny battle maps, the legend starts reeking of ego, alcohol, paranoia, and rage with a royal budget. He killed Clitus, a close companion who had once saved his life, during a drunken argument that spiraled into murder. Then there is Persepolis, looted and burned in a spectacle later tradition struggled to explain as revenge, drunken chaos, political theater, or some miserable combination of all three. Add his growing taste for divine-style authority, and the heroic genius begins looking like an empire-sized warning sign with excellent cavalry. Alexander was dazzling. He was also the kind of man who could conquer half the known world and still lose a battle against impulse control. 9. Arthur Schopenhauer built a whole philosophical reputation around pessimism, suffering, misery, and the depressing machinery of existence, which sounds deep until you remember he also personally contributed to suffering and then complained about the invoice. In Berlin, he got into a confrontation with an older woman named Caroline Louise Marquet, who was talking loudly near his apartment. Schopenhauer shoved her, she fell, and her injuries were serious enough that a court ordered him to pay her a pension for years. Did this produce humility, remorse, or any grand reflection on human cruelty? Not exactly. He later grumbled in writing about having to pay compensation, which is almost too perfectly ironic to be real. So yes, he understood suffering, especially when it appeared in abstract philosophy or came with someone else's bruises. Apparently, pessimism feels much cleaner when you are the one doing the pushing. 10. Winston Churchill earned part of his heroic reputation through his role in resisting Nazi Germany, and that part of the story is real. But outside that dramatic wartime spotlight, the record becomes much harder to polish. In 1919, Churchill wrote that he was strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against groups he described as uncivilized tribes, a phrase that basically walks into the room carrying its own imperial alarm siren. Then, there is Bengal in 1943, where famine killed millions and British wartime policy failed the region catastrophically, with many historians arguing imperial decisions worsened the disaster. Churchill did not create the famine by himself, but his government's priorities and his own callous attitudes are part of why his legacy is fiercely contested. He could be magnificent against Hitler and still cruel within empire. Statues are convenient like that. They keep the cigar and lose the policy memo. 11. Thomas Edison is usually sold as the friendly wizard of invention, the man who sprinkled light bulbs over civilization like industrial fairy dust. The real Edison was much less cuddly. He was a ruthless business fighter who battled through patent wars, crushed rivals when he could, and helped turn the War of Currents into a public fear campaign. During the fight against alternating current, animals were electrocuted in demonstrations designed to convince people that rival electrical systems were terrifyingly dangerous. Because apparently, let the technology compete fairly was too boring, and brand the enemy with dead animals had more theatrical punch. Edison was brilliant, no argument. He was also territorial, manipulative, and perfectly willing to weaponize panic when it helped his side. His inventions still matter. But the bedtime version where genius arrives neatly packaged with virtue deserves to be unplugged. 12. Christopher Columbus still gets remembered in some places as the bold genius who opened the New World, which is already awkward because you cannot discover a land full of people who are very clearly already living there. What he did help open was a system of conquest and exploitation that devastated indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, especially the Taíno. As governor on Hispaniola, Columbus became notorious even among some contemporaries for brutal rule, harsh punishments, and such abusive governance that he was eventually arrested and removed from office. That should absolutely obliterate the cheerful schoolbook version, because Spanish imperial authorities were not exactly famous for being delicate about cruelty. The colonial system that followed brought forced labor, mutilation, sexual violence, and demographic catastrophe. Columbus was not merely a determined sailor with terrible geography. He was a doorway through which domination walked in carrying a flag. 13. Fritz Haber is one of history's most disturbing both things can be true cases. On one side, he helped develop the ammonia process that made synthetic fertilizer possible, a breakthrough that transformed agriculture and helped feed billions. On the other side, he became a passionate champion of chemical warfare during the First World War and played a central role in Germany's poison gas program. This was not an innocent scientist making a discovery and then watching bad people misuse it from a safe moral distance. Haber himself pushed chlorine gas as a battlefield weapon, believing poison could break the military deadlock. The contradiction is almost unbearable. He helped humanity grow more food and helped armies suffocate human beings more efficiently. That is not a legacy. That is a moral car crash in a laboratory coat. Scientific brilliance is powerful, but without conscience, it can become very efficient horror. 14. Cleopatra is usually packaged as the glamorous queen of Egypt, wrapped in romance, luxury, charisma, and enough dramatic eyeliner to power a film industry. The real Cleopatra lived in the vicious world of Ptolemaic dynastic politics, where family was not a cozy support network, but a queue of potential threats with matching bloodlines. She married her brothers because that was normal in her ruling dynasty, fought a brutal civil war in which one brother died, likely removed another by poison as she tightened control, and almost certainly pushed for the execution of her sister Arsinoe when Arsinoe became politically dangerous. So no, Cleopatra was not just floating through history as Caesar and Antony's seductive love interest. She was intelligent, calculating, and fully capable of clearing relatives out of the path to power. The romance sells posters. The sibling bloodshed is what kept the throne warm in the background. 15. Pythagoras is usually introduced as the wise old grandfather of triangles, a peaceful math sage who probably smelled like chalk, olives, and mysterious intelligence. But the world around him looks less like a math classroom and more like a strange spiritual brotherhood with secrecy, rituals, silence, and rules weird enough to make modern conspiracy groups feel underdressed. His followers followed odd restrictions, including the famous ban on beans, because Pythagorean tradition connected beans with impurity, death, and even the souls of the dead. Then there is the darker legend tied to the group. Later ancient stories claimed that a member who revealed forbidden knowledge about irrational numbers or some other secret teaching was destroyed, though the drowning tale is probably more legend than proven history. Still, the vibe is incredible. One of mathematics' biggest names may have led a mystical anti-bean circle where curiosity was welcome only until it ruined the cult atmosphere. 16. Jean-Jacques Rousseau became one of Europe's great celebrity voices on how children should be raised, educated, loved, guided, and allowed to develop naturally. His writing on education was treated as profound, full of beautiful ideas about innocence, morality, childhood, and the ways adults corrupt everything they touch. Small inconvenience. According to Rousseau himself, he sent all 5 of his newborn children to the Foundling Hospital in Paris, where infant survival rates were grim enough to make the decision feel like abandonment, wearing a powdered wig. He offered excuses about poverty, circumstances, and inconvenience, which is a very philosophical way of saying fatherhood did not fit neatly into his life plan. So the man who lectured Europe about ideal child-rearing did not raise his own children at all. It is one of history's most brutal hypocrisies, writing the parenting manual while misplacing the actual children. Rousseau basically invented educational theory and skipped the practical assignment. 17. Henry Ford did not hide his anti-Semitism in some dusty private corner where future biographers could awkwardly pretend not to see it. He used his fortune, fame, and newspaper to pump it into public life with the confidence of a man who thought building cars made him qualified to diagnose society. Through the Dearborn Independent, Ford spread conspiratorial hatred of Jews and helped normalize ideas that traveled far beyond the United States. Hitler admired him so much that Ford became the only American specifically praised in Mein Kampf, which is not a subtle historical clue. That is a screaming warning sign with flashing bulbs. Yes, Ford revolutionized manufacturing and changed modern industry. He also mass-produced bigotry with horrifying efficiency. That combination is what makes him so disturbing. Brilliant enough to reshape factories, rotten enough to help mainstream hatred. Some assembly lines produce cars, some produce poison with better distribution. 18. Peter the Great is praised as the ruler who modernized Russia, westernized the elite, and tried to drag an enormous empire into a new age, whether it screamed or not. The problem is that Peter often treated reform with the emotional warmth of a falling anvil. He humiliated nobles over their beards, personally shaving them or ordering them shaved because he wanted the upper class to look more European, then backed the whole makeover campaign with taxes and coercion. Imagine a ruler so committed to modernization that even your chin became a government issue. But the darkest part is his son Alexei. Accused of treason, Alexei was tortured during the investigation and died in prison before the formal execution could even happen. That is not strict parenting. That is dynastic nightmare with imperial paperwork. Peter did not simply reshape Russia. He tried to carve it with blades, terror, and absolutely no soft conversation. 19. Hammurabi is remembered as the mighty Babylonian king of justice, the ancient lawgiver behind the famous idea of an eye for an eye. That sounds satisfyingly fair until you actually look at the code and realize the justice system had the moral balance of a crooked staircase. Punishments depended heavily on social status. Hurt someone of equal rank, and you might face direct retaliation. Hurt someone lower in rank, and the matter could often be settled with payment. So this was not universal justice shining across Mesopotamia like a bronze sunrise. It was law built around hierarchy, where elite bodies and poor bodies came with different price tags. Hammurabi did not invent fairness so much as give organized inequality a memorable slogan and a very impressive stone display. Ancient states, as it turns out, were already excellent at making privilege sound like order. 20. Walt Disney's public image is all castles, talking animals, childhood wonder, and enough weaponized nostalgia to make grown adults cry while buying overpriced snacks. The historical Disney was not nearly that soft focus. His studio maintained openly sexist hiring practices, with rejection letters explaining that women were not considered for creative animation roles, as if imagination had somehow been assigned a male-only department. Then came the 1941 strike, when Disney reacted bitterly to labor unrest, and the Magic Kingdom became a much less magical workplace. Add the uncomfortable fact that he met Leni Riefenstahl in late 1938 after Kristallnacht, when many in Hollywood wanted distance from Nazi prestige, and the sparkle fades even faster. This does not make Disney a cartoon villain with theme music, but it does ruin the simple image of America's smiling uncle with a sketchpad. Behind the mouse was a controlling boss with old biases. 21. John Harvey Kellogg helped give the world breakfast cereal, which sounds innocent until you realize he treated breakfast like a weapon in a moral war against human desire. He believed bland food could suppress sexual urges, especially masturbation, which he feared with the intensity most people reserve for invasion, plague, or a truly terrible dinner party. Cornflakes were not just a snack idea. They were part of a larger project to make food so plain that the body would supposedly stop getting rebellious ideas. Then the story gets much darker, because Kellogg was also a committed supporter of eugenics and racial betterment, turning his health crusade from weird into genuinely poisonous. So behind the cereal pioneer image was a man who wanted to regulate appetite, behavior, and society itself with terrifying confidence. Imagine making breakfast so aggressively boring that it came with ideological side effects. 22. Steve Jobs is remembered as the visionary who transformed technology, made gadgets feel like cultural events, and somehow convinced the future to arrive in sleeker packaging. He was also, by many accounts, extraordinarily difficult and often cruel, with charisma that did not exactly overflow into kindness. For years, he denied paternity of his daughter Lisa, even after DNA evidence made the truth extremely hard to dodge, and the emotional damage from that rejection lasted far longer than any product launch applause. The larger pattern fits: brilliant, magnetic, driven, and so convinced of his own importance that normal rules seemed like optional decorations for ordinary people. That is why the famous habit of parking in disabled spaces feels so revealing. It was not just rude. It was a daily little statue to the idea that inconvenience belonged to someone else. Revolutionary products, yes. Spiritually exhausting entitlement, also yes. 23. Mother Teresa's public image was built from compassion, simplicity, sacrifice, and a saintly aura so strong it almost feels protected by soft lighting. But critics, including medical observers, argued for years that her homes for the dying often offered inadequate medical care and insufficient pain relief, even while she herself received advanced treatment when ill. That contrast is where the halo starts to wobble. If suffering is spiritually meaningful, it becomes a very suspicious doctrine when it seems most noble for poor strangers and much less attractive when your own body is involved. Defenders argue that her mission was not designed to operate as a modern hospital and that context matters. But the criticism remains serious because pain relief is not some luxury for spoiled people. It is basic mercy. The saintly image survives beautifully in photographs. It becomes harder to package once someone asks what happened to the morphine. 24. Julius Caesar is usually presented as the brilliant general who conquered Gaul, reshaped Rome, and walked into history with the confidence of a man already posing for marble. But the full picture is much darker. His campaigns in Gaul involved massacres, mass enslavement, destroyed communities, and violence on such an enormous scale that some modern historians discuss it in genocidal terms. Caesar described his victories with smooth literary confidence, essentially writing his own legend while standing on piles of bodies and calling it strategy. Ancient numbers are always tricky, but the scale of killing, displacement, and enslavement was unquestionably catastrophic. This was not noble statecraft glowing under Roman banners. It was ambition, debt, vanity, and military prestige fed by the suffering of entire peoples. Rome got glory. Caesar got immortality. Gaul got turned into a warning sign. Conquerors sound much cleaner once carved in stone. 25. Thomas Jefferson wrote one of the most beautiful political sentences in history, then lived as if it came with a giant invisible exception clause. the man who declared that all men are created equal enslaved more than 600 people over his lifetime and depended on their forced labor to maintain his estate, comfort, status, and public career. This was not a tiny, awkward detail that history unfairly glued to him later. He managed the system, profited from it, sold people when debts pressed him, and freed only a very small number. That is why Jefferson is so hard to turn into a clean marble saint. He was one of the most educated men in the Atlantic world, fully capable of understanding moral arguments, and he still chose convenience over principle again and again. The words were revolutionary. The plantation was brutality with elegant handwriting. 26. Martin Luther shattered the religious monopoly of Western Christendom, launched the Reformation, and became one of the most influential figures in European history. Then, late in life, he wrote anti-Jewish texts so vicious they still feel toxic centuries later. In On the Jews and Their Lies, Luther called for burning synagogues, destroying Jewish books, seizing property, and crushing Jewish life through open persecution. These were not just rude remarks from a bitter old man having a spectacularly bad week. They were sustained hatred written by a religious giant whose words carried enormous authority. Later, Nazi propagandists eagerly republished and cited Luther's anti-Jewish writings because they fit far too comfortably into their own ideology. Scholars can debate the exact lines of influence, but nobody serious can pretend the texts are harmless. Reformation heroism looks much less clean when this manuscript follows it through the church door. 27. Jacques Cousteau is remembered as the beloved poet of the sea, the red-capped explorer who taught millions to admire oceans, coral reefs, and marine life. But early Cousteau could behave less like a guardian of nature and more like a man who believed the best way to study an ecosystem was to attack it and count the wreckage. In the Silent World era, he and his team used dynamite on coral reefs to conduct what they called a more complete fish census, which is an impressively elegant phrase for, "We blew up the neighborhood and counted the bodies." That same period also drew criticism over shark treatment and a whale calf mortally injured after a collision with the ship. To be fair, Cousteau later evolved into a major conservation voice, but the early chapters still matter. The world's most famous ocean protector sometimes began like an underwater demolition hobbyist with a camera crew. 28. Leopold II of Belgium sold himself to Europe as a humanitarian, philanthropist, and civilizing ruler, which has to be one of the bleakest branding victories in modern history. Behind the polished speeches, he turned the Congo Free State into his personal extraction machine, where forced labor, terror, hostage-taking, mutilation, and mass death were tied to rubber profits and colonial control. Exact death tolls remain debated, but the devastation reached into the millions and cannot be morally rescued by polite diplomatic language. What makes Leopold especially revolting is the double performance. In Europe, he wore the costume of benevolence. In Africa, his system produced a chamber of horrors with paperwork. This was colonialism with a public relations department and a private nightmare factory. If evil ever put on a tailored suit and asked to be praised for charity, Leopold was already posing for the portrait. 29. Saint Olga of Kiev is remembered as a saintly ruler and one of the great figures of early Kievan history. But the revenge story attached to her sounds like it was written by someone who considered restraint a personal weakness. According to the primary chronicle, after her husband Igor was killed by the Drevlians, Olga answered with punishments so theatrical and savage that modern screenwriters might reject them for being too dramatic. One group of envoys was buried alive. Another was burned inside a bathhouse. Then, after a siege, the city of Iskorostan was supposedly set on fire, using birds carrying smoldering material back to rooftops. Historians debate how literally to read every detail, but the tradition itself is unforgettable. Her memory fused sanctity with terrifying, almost operatic revenge. Olga was canonized, yes, but the road there came decorated with enough vengeance imagery to make ordinary royal grudges look adorable. 30. Franklin D. Roosevelt is rightly remembered for leading the United States through Depression and World War, but that heroic image carries a stain too large for patriotic music to cover. In 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which helped set in motion the forced removal and incarceration of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them from the West Coast and many of them American citizens. Families lost homes, businesses, years of freedom, and the comforting fantasy that constitutional rights automatically survive national panic. This was not some vague bureaucratic accident happening far below the president's desk. Roosevelt authorized the machinery that made it possible. That does not erase the New Deal or wartime leadership, but it does destroy the idea that his moral judgment was always steady and noble. Even iconic leaders become dangerous when fear gets official stationery. 31. Edwin Hubble helped transform astronomy and gave his name to one of the most famous telescopes ever built, which should have been enough glory for one lifetime. Apparently, Hubble wanted a more cinematic resume. He spent years polishing and exaggerating his personal story, presenting himself as a dramatic war hero in ways reality did not support. His division in the First World War never actually saw combat, yet he enjoyed telling stories that made him sound like a wounded frontline veteran. It is a strangely needy kind of vanity, because his real achievements were already enormous. The man helped humanity understand that the universe was far larger than anyone had imagined. And then, for some reason, he decided his biography needed expansion too. Nothing says astronomer quite like stretching the truth until it feels cosmic. He measured galaxies, but apparently could not resist inflating himself. 32. Albert Einstein transformed physics, reshaped humanity's understanding of space and time, and became the global mascot for genius, which makes his private behavior land with extra force. During the collapse of his first marriage, he gave Mileva Maric a list of domestic conditions that reads like a frozen office memo written by a man who confused marriage with staff management. She was expected to keep his clothes and meals in order, avoid intimacy, leave his room when instructed, and stop speaking immediately if he demanded it. Nothing says loving partnership quite like please function as a silent household appliance. That ugly list does not erase relativity, but it absolutely crushes the childish fantasy that brilliance automatically comes with kindness, wisdom, or basic decency. Einstein could explain the behavior of light while treating empathy like an unproven hypothesis. He had equations for the universe, but not for the person beside him. So here's the uncomfortable part. Which hero got away too easily? Drop the name in the comments, especially if it is someone people still defend like their statue has legal representation. And if this video made you side-eye a textbook, hit like and subscribe, because we are not here to polish legends. We are here to check what is hiding under the gold paint.